Let me come home with you. Is there room for one more? Can I come home with you? Let me come home with you. Can I come home with you? Is there room for one more? Bring me home. There's room for one more. Yay!
Hello, Internet! Welcome to Book Theory! Because if you have one moderately popular indie Smash game in your franchise, chances are you also have yourself a 10-installment book deal. That's barely an exaggeration. Bendy and the Ink Machine, 3, with more promised on the way. Hello Neighbor, 6. Heck, it's a surprise that Baldi's Basics doesn't have an entire trilogy dedicated to the horrific backstory of the Jump Rope Girl.
That makes me sad.
No joke, at this point in my life, I'm reading more video games than I'm playing. But of course today, we're not talking about any of those other franchises. We're talking about the Grandpappy, the one that paved the way for all those who would dare to follow in its footsteps. Five Nights at Freddy's and its 8 books, as well as its 2 graphic novel reimaginings of the first 2 books. But here's the best part here, friends. True to this franchise, the books were supposed to end at Fazbear Frights number 5. We're currently at Fazbear Frights number 3. The end was in sight. That was gonna be it. That was the end of the line. Mystery over. But oh no, my friends, of course not. Now, there are 2 more final installments announced, just like every game after FNAF 3. I used to joke that the fan was the scariest part of this franchise. Oh no, not anymore, dear theorists. Now, it's multi-platform merchandising. So Fazbear Frights number 3, titled 1:35 a.m., just came out, and whoo boy, there is a lot to talk about with this one. If you'll remember, Scott has made it pretty darn clear that this new book series is meant to help us solve the mysteries from the past, and that the stories are, as they say in every book's official description, pulled from all different corners of the FNAF lore. But unlike the past 2 Fazbear Frights books, where the connections have been a bit looser, I suppose is the best way to describe a time-traveling ball pit that leads to a scene of some 1985 pizzeria murders, the stories contained in this one, in 1:35 a.m., all feel very strongly connected to, well, like I just said, every corner of the FNAF canon. The stories here are starting to show how they're connected to not only each other, but also how they're connected to the original book trilogy, and yes, how they're even connected to the games, creating this elaborate web of complicated animatronic death. But more than anything else, these books are starting to confirm things for us. Theories and suspicions that we've had for the better part of the last 5 years, which, you know, is kinda nice to receive some level of validation. Like I said, it is a lot to cover, and so I'm gonna cover this one like I've covered the last 2 books. Today's episode is gonna be dedicated to a general overview of the stories, spotlighting some of the most important details for theory crafting, and explaining what I think this new batch of stories is trying to tell us about the series' mysteries. And then the next video, we're gonna be doing a deep dive into probably the biggest mystery of all 3 books so far, FNAF's newest killer animatronic, the Stitch Wraith. This guy is actually really interesting, and his story is starting to weave through most of the 9 other small stories that we've covered in these other books, and what he means might actually have some severe implications for not just the original trilogy of novels, but also the future of the games. Like I said, more on that next week, but for today, let's start with our title story, 1:35 a.m. This one is pretty straightforward. Delilah is a young woman with a tragic backstory. Her parents both died when she was 11, at which point she was bounced around and abused, sadly, in the foster care system for years. Eventually, she finds a stable home and happiness with a man named Richard. They get married, and Delilah excitedly looks forward to finally having a child of her own so she can finally complete the family that she never had. Everything is going great in her life until Richard divorces her. Now she's alone and sadder than ever. And then she dies, trapped in a ventilation shaft after being tortured by the embodiment of the child that she never had. Children's entertainment, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so I may have skipped a few steps there, but it's roughly the idea. One day, Delilah finds an animatronic doll named Ella at a garage sale. A doll that reminds her of the child that she always dreamed of having. Quote, with brown curly hair, big dark eyes, and plump pink cheeks, the doll looked almost exactly like the baby Delilah had envisioned having someday with Richard. She'd been sure that she was gonna be a mother, so sure that she'd named the baby before the baby was even conceived. Her name would be Emma. Delilah reached for the tag that hung on the doll's wrist. My name is Ella. Ella. so close to Emma. Delilah felt an odd tingle slither through her body, end quote. She buys the doll, in part because it reminds her of her almost never child, and because it has a built-in alarm clock. Emotionally scarring with a side of functionality, just the way I like it. Anyway, she sets the alarm inside of Ella for 1:35 p.m. to help wake her up for her shift at work, but the alarm doesn't go off. And just like that, Delilah gets her first taste of parental disappointment. So she does what any good parent would do in that situation, immediately hurls her would-be child into the nearest dumpster. Yikes, Delilah. Maybe it's better that you and Richard didn't have that kid after all. Anyway, that night she's awoken at 1:35 a.m. by Ella. Delilah assumes that she accidentally set the alarm for a.m. rather than p.m., which reminds me of the time I didn't bother to set the clock right on my Tamagotchi and was forced to scoop his poop every day at 4 in the morning. I can't imagine why he died. Certainly not my fault. Anyway, she tries to find the trashed Ella doll, but can't. And from that point forward is slowly driven insane by the doll waking her up every morning at 1:35. I mean, 1:35 is still early enough at night to get a decent night's sleep. It's not a 3 a.m. challenge or anything like that, but whatever. Yeah, knowing that she'll never feel safe again, she climbs into a ventilation shaft in a building under construction and dies. Quote from the book, "She'd never wanted things, she wanted love." Oof, it is a heartbreaker. Man, the stories in these books so far have been pretty sad, but this one is just tragic. In fact, all 3 stories from this particular book are just rough. Now, this story has 2 really important details in it. Details that seem to make Delilah's horrific struggle a strange nexus point for both the original book canon as well as the games. So let's start with the books first. In 1:35 a.m., the Ella doll is described as a, quote, helper doll manufactured by Fazbear Entertainment. Continuing forward with that quote, the booklet had a list of what Ella was designed for. She could keep time and serve as an alarm clock, manage appointments, keep track of lists, take photos, read stories, sing songs, and even serve drinks. Serve drinks? Delilah shook her head. Now, in the games, we never really get to learn much about Henry, the creator of the animatronics, but in the novel trilogy, Silver Eyes, Twisted Ones, and Fourth Closet, we get to meet not only his daughter Charlie, but also some of his other creations, including, wouldn't you know it, a doll named Ella, who is built to serve tea. From the Silver Eyes novel, quote, out sailed Ella on her track, a child-sized doll bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands like an offering, end quote. Now, across all 3 novels, we never get a solid physical description of the Ella doll, but in another book, The Freddy Files, which collects all the main information about the franchise, we do get to see our first illustration of the doll, and wouldn't you know it, everything matches the description of Delilah's little garage sale find from 1:35 a.m. Quote again, wearing a puffy-sleeved 1980s-era bright blue full-skirted dress with pink ruffled trim and a big bow around the waist, end quote. It's the same doll, meaning that this first story is happening in the novel timeline after the events of Fourth Closet. Somehow, this is the doll that Henry created for his daughter Charlie, who, I need to technically remind you, is his daughter, because again, remember, his daughter died at a young age, and he replaced her with a series of 4 robots that represent Charlie growing up at various ages, so Ella technically is an early version of his own daughter. Figured I'd throw that little factoid in there since, this is a real and totally valid plot point from the novelized series of events in this very easy to understand series. But that's not all. While I was reading the story, the way Delilah decides to hide in the ventilation shaft felt really strange to me. Like, why? It was super random, but also was one of those things that felt so oddly specific that it felt like it had to have had a bigger purpose. So I dug around and found this for you. For your consideration, I present to you Night 2 of Sister Location.
So, funny story. A dead body was found in this vent once. Okay, so not that funny, but it's a story.
So, could Delilah be that body that was actually found in the vents of Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals? Maybe, but probably more likely it's alluding to that story from Sister Location rather than directly the same one. You see, in the book, we're told that Delilah's vent is in a site that's under construction, a 3-story structure that feels a bit like an office building. Sister Location, meanwhile, takes place in an underground facility underneath a residential home, so it's probably not the same building. At the same time, though, the story makes it clear that Delilah Delilah was drawn to this place. Quote, the answer to her plight was in here. She was sure of it. Someplace here she was gonna find a way to escape Ella forever, end quote. Time and again throughout all of these Fazbear Fright stories, we're shown people being drawn to the Freddy Fazbear locations through some supernatural force. So could Delilah, or whoever died in the Vents of Sister location, have been compelled to come there? And this story is just giving us a hint as to how that happened. Maybe. And whereas the Delilah Sister location connection might just be me reading too far into things, that certainly isn't true for our second story, Room for One More. In this story, and stop me if any of this sounds familiar, Stanley is a night guard at a mysterious underground facility full of little ballerina dolls looking to escape to the surface. Ding, ding, ding! It's like in one sentence we just won FNAF bingo. Each night he falls asleep on the job, wakes up to find a mini Rena doll on the desk asking to go home with him. Stanley falls asleep again, and when he wakes up, the doll is magically gone. Over the next few days, his arms start to swell, his throat starts to bleed, and yet he keeps going to work, keeps finding dolls, and keeps falling asleep. Eventually, he learns that the dolls have been crawling into his mouth while he sleeps, causing his body to swell to the point of bursting. The end. The moral of this story, kiddos, be a good employee. Don't sleep on the job, otherwise little animatronic creatures are gonna crawl into you and make you explode from the inside out. What's also interesting about this story is Stanley's dreams. Each time he sleeps while on duty, he has himself a strange dream. In the first, Funtime Foxy is a cab driver. In the second, the facility's power cuts off and he comes face to face with Funtime Freddy. And in the last one, Ennard is a dentist and Ballora is his dental assistant, which I would say is one of the strangest things to ever appear in this franchise, but then again, I turn your attention to this corner where we have time-traveling ball pit, anime Foxy, Yandere Chica. Anyway, this one is pretty obvious, right? Stanley is working at Circus Babies Entertainment and Rentals, that underground facility from Sister Location, and the dolls crawling into his mouth are a parallel to Ennard using Michael's progressively decaying body as a skin suit in that game's secret ending. I think this story might be trying to give us a more realistic interpretation of those events, or something that more closely matches what we see happening in those ending cutscenes. That instead of Michael being scooped and having his skeleton removed and all of that at the same time, that our protagonist Michael instead is being slowly filled up with animatronic pieces night after night, giving him that progressively sickly look that scares all the people around him. Stanley's story even mentions this, quote, he staggered and stumbled down the sidewalk. Passers-by stared, some seeming worried, others just annoyed, like it inconvenienced them to see another person suffering, which feels right on point with how those cutscenes were depicted in Sister Location. But okay, of the 3 stories in 1:35 a.m., it's story number 3, New Kid, that's the most exciting to talk about, at least for today's episode, because this one gets to the heart of what is still to this day the single biggest question of the series, and that is the identity of Golden Freddy. Let me tell you, I thought we had this one pretty well nailed down, that it was Cassidy, aka the vengeful spirit from Ultimate Custom Night, and yet this story, well, it causes me to question a few things about our conclusions. First, let's go through a quick summary. Devin is a 9th grade social loner alongside his only friend Mick. One day, a new kid in school named Kelsey shows interest in spending time with the two of them. Kelsey is good looking, he's charismatic, he immediately attracts the attention of all the cool kids in school. And even though Kelsey, Devin, and Mick all get along as friends, eventually Devin gets jealous of Kelsey, because Kelsey has everything that Devin wants. And so to get some revenge, he lures him to an abandoned Freddy's restaurant long forgotten at the outskirts of the town. His plan is to trap Kelsey in a spring-lock suit for a few hours to scare him, but, well, you know what's gonna happen. The sheer mention of spring-lock suit immediately gives you a spoiler alert as to what's gonna go down. Kelsey puts on the Golden Freddy suit and gets skewered alive, quote. The blood saturated the bear's matted fur in seconds and began pooling on the floor. Devin stared at the moving blood. It looked like it was a living thing. A thinking red liquid lake stretching out. End quote. Mick and Devin leave Kelsey for dead for fear of Devin getting in trouble, but they're not quite sure he actually died. Nearly a week later, Devin is convinced to go back and check on Kelsey, but when he does, he's in for a surprise. Kelsey has vanished. Devin eventually sticks his hand inside the suit's mouth to feel around for Kelsey's slumped over dead body, only for the spring locks to fail again and crush his arm. As Devin lies on the floor, trapped and slowly bleeding to death, he gets a final glimpse into the suit and, well, let's just say what he sees inside rocks the foundation of what we know about this franchise. Quote, Devin wiggled in one more attempt to free himself. The mouth opened even more and Devin got a sudden glimpse inside the suit. He gasped. down low, past his arm, Devin could see a dead body, just like he thought he'd find when he came back here to check. But it wasn't exactly like he thought he'd find. This one had curly black hair. The body in the suit wasn't Kelsey. Now, there's a lot of weird things about this story that I don't quite have answers for, but I do have some thoughts about. First and foremost is the ending. You see, the book doesn't end with Devin's death like you would expect. It actually continues to a final scene with Kelsey, alive and well, as the new kid at school introducing himself to two boys. It seems, at a first reading, like this should be a flashback to when Kelsey first meets Mick and Devin at school. Like, this was the fateful meeting that would eventually lead to multiple of their deaths. But it's not. This is Kelsey at a new school meeting two new boys. In the story, Mick meets Kelsey first and then brings Kelsey over to meet Devin, and it all takes place in a classroom. This closing scene, meanwhile, is outside the front doors of a school, and the two boys Kelsey introduced himself to are less social outcasts like Mick and Devin, and more like bullies. We're expressly told that the boys are snickering at the passing kids. Even Kelsey's first line to them is different. It implies that Kelsey has somehow lived on after his supposed Springtrap death in Golden Freddy, and now he's the new kid at yet another new school, introducing himself to two new kids. And the way that this final scene is written, with Kelsey scoping out the two boys from afar before he approaches them, it feels like he's actively targeting loner kids to make friends with. Could this be Kelsey's attempt to befriend kids that most overlook and then lure them back to a Freddy's pizzeria for some tragic incident to happen? It seems like it would be a stretch, but let's talk about Kelsey himself. Mr. Perfect. Kelsey is a weird entity in all this. Throughout the story, there are moments when his behavior is specifically called out as slightly off. Quote from the book, Kelsey tilted his head and studied Devin for a couple of seconds. For those 2 seconds, Devin had the weird feeling he was being evaluated. And again later, Devin was tempted to stab Kelsey to see if he was a robot. Kids don't say stuff like that. Once they're actually at the pizzeria, things go surprisingly smoothly for Devin's plan. The line in the book even goes like this, quote, this was going even better than he imagined. He thought he was gonna have to talk Kelsey into trying on the Golden Freddy suit, but it looked like he was gonna do it all on his own. It was like it was meant to be. All of it seems to cast some level of suspicion on Kelsey's true motivations, and that's without me even mentioning the fact that his body just goes missing at the end of the book when it has been skewered and bled to death. To me, it feels like Kelsey may just be our vengeful spirit from Ultimate Custom Night. In the story, Kelsey is described as having wavy blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, we have a pretty solid idea that its hair is straight, with a slight wave, and it appears to be blonde. But here's the kicker. This image was created by inverting colors. It's what gives it that blown out and kind of creepy appearance. If you invert the colors of the vengeful spirit's eyes, you get blue, just like Kelsey is described in the book. And it would fit the idea of a vengeful spirit, a kid who is angry about his own death, perhaps in an accident like we see in FNAF 4, or in this particular story, looking to get revenge on other kids who are similar to his original killers. He goes from school to school, presumably ones near Fazbear locations, to somehow trick kids into getting killed by the suit. The parallels with vengeful spirit even go to the moments right around Kelsey's death in the book. This is how it's described, and the sound wasn't the bad part. It was bad, yes, but the bad part, the really, really bad part, was the way the suit started jerking in a spastic, horrific dance. It looked like the moth-eaten, mildew-blotched gold bear was convulsing, but it wasn't the bear, it was Kelsey. It's remarkably similar to the final cutscene from Ultimate Custom Night, where we see again an angry Golden Freddy, presumably filled with the vengeful spirit, twitching off into the darkness. Also worth noting is that the spring-lock suits are apparently big enough for kids to slump down into the body. Devin, when he initially can't find Kelsey's body inside the suit, decides to dig deeper down into it. Quote, had Kelsey somehow slid down into the suit? Was that his hair that Devin could see? This, to me, confirms what we see in FNAF 4's storage room cutscene, the strange tuft of hair that's coming out of the body of the suit. Back then, we weren't sure what this was trying to tell us, what that tuft of hair was meant to be. But now, I think we can safely conclude that it is indeed a child stuffed into that body, and that we're only seeing the top tuft of hair poking out. It would seem to imply that there was a victim before the the bite of 1983, and that the crying child was somehow aware of at least one, if not multiple, of past victims shoved inside the suits. But all of this brings us to the obvious question of this story: the curly black hair at the bottom of the suit. Who's that? And honestly, I'm not sure. Cassidy, which is what we've been assuming to be Golden Freddy's name this entire time, does indeed have black hair, but it's always been described as long and straight. In the fourth closet, we physically see Cassidy, and she's described as this, quote, "That's Cassidy, a girl with long black hair approached." And in the survival logbook, where we first learned of Cassidy's name, there's this girl who again has long, black, straight hair. And that's something worth pointing out, for as chaotic as the story in this franchise has been for all its iterations, names and hairstyles and colors of the victims seem to be fairly consistent. Susie is always associated with her dog. She has blonde hair with curls and blue eyes. Cassidy always appears to have straight black hair. Fritz always has freckles. The names and the faces of the surrounding characters may change, but the missing children all seem to be fairly consistent in both name and physical description, which is an important detail to keep track of moving forward. So could all of this mean that Vengeful Spirit and Cassidy are two separate entities? That two spirits might both be in possession of Golden Freddy, or that Cassidy isn't really associated with Golden Freddy at all, and is instead the identity of one of the other animatronics? Because in Fourth Closet, she technically wasn't the one who was associated with Golden Freddy. Honestly, I don't know. I need to actually review the evidence for this one, and I encourage you to do the same. The last thing worth mentioning for all of us to chew on is the mysterious slithering that's heard throughout this story. While the boys are exploring the abandoned pizzeria, they hear something inexplicable in the walls. Quote, "While they were in the bathroom, Devin was pretty sure he heard something slithering through the walls. He didn't say anything. From the way the other boys' faces paled, he knew they heard it too. They didn't mention it either." It's never mentioned again. Nothing ever comes of this strange little detail, but it's clearly important because more inexplicable, strange sounds come from the Freddy torso after Kelsey dies. In a later quote, "Did you leave anything else?" He tried to ignore the fact that the scuttling sound was coming from the bear suit. Now, this is after Kelsey has already stopped squirming and twitching. So again, we're left with some mysterious force moving around in the pizzeria creating these sorts of sounds. Is it Ennard? Is it the Stitch Wraith? Is it something else? Like I said, lots to chew on with this particular book, but as you can tell, it's given us pretty explicit information about some of the biggest questions that this series has had. Now it's up to us, as always, to put all those pieces together. And there certainly are a lot of pieces that'll start coming together next time as we start looking into the power of agony and the twisted timeline of FNAF's next newest murderer, the Stitch Wraith. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to get notified of when that video comes out next week. And in the meantime, do me a favor, remember, it's just a theory, a game theory. Thanks for watching.